Okay, well, thank you so much for coming. It really is a pleasure to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing. So I'm Candice Howarth. I'm Head of Local Climate Action at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change. And I've been doing quite a lot of research on heat risk and resilience to heat waves in the UK. So thankfully, I was able to do a lot of this work as a result of some funding I got from the LSE Impact Fund and co-funded by the Place-Based Climate Action Network. So this research comes out of some work from the last 18 months. You might feel it's a little bit unusual to be talking about extreme heat. I mean, coming into the room, everyone's in their overcoats. I saw a really impressive hat. So we're not really thinking about heat at the moment. But on a day, especially like today, where we have clear skies, it's important to bear in mind that some buildings, for example, aren't equipped to stay cool or warm in certain conditions. So even on days like today, some buildings will become quite hot, and some of the residents within those buildings will become even more vulnerable, especially if we're talking about people over a certain age, people with underlying health conditions. So whilst this presentation is about extreme heat, so thinking about those summer periods, we need to be thinking about heat in general for the UK, which is something which historically we've not really had to think about. But because of climate change, this is becoming more and more important. Now, just in case many of you aren't really familiar with the climate change landscape, when it comes to action on climate change, there really are two primary ways in which we're trying to address this. The first is in terms of mitigation, where we're trying to find ways to reduce emissions that contribute to a warming effect of the globe. And then the second aspect is adaptation. We know we're already locked into some of the impacts of climate change, so we need to become more resilient to some of those risks. So to give you a little bit of context of where we stand when it comes to climate change, the world has already experienced over 1.1 degree in terms of global warming. So with that comes a number of risks that the UK and the globe are going to face. And those are the types of risks that we need to be thinking about. But adaptation around these climate impacts really is insufficient. We're trying to get a lot of ambition globally, and when it comes to the UK, there is a lot of action happening on adaptation, but when it comes to heat, this really hasn't been a priority for a number of reasons, primarily because it's not a risk that we've been exposed to and we've had to deal with historically. We've mainly been talking about flooding, about drought, impacts on crops and so forth. So heat is very much a new risk. But when we think about these types of risks, and because we're so close to a tipping point in terms of thinking about the impacts of climate change, a lot of the work that I've been doing has been looking at how can we look at adaptation and mitigation together. Often adaptation and mitigation happen in isolation. So you'll have efforts, say, for local authorities who are aiming to reduce their emissions, so they come up with these climate action plans, these climate mitigation plans, and often you might then have a separate adaptation plan. What we've seen historically is that mitigation has very much been driving the efforts for climate action, and in some cases, up until recently, climate adaptation has really lagged behind. But we are seeing more and more efforts when it comes to bringing the two together. And the work that we've been doing has been looking at how can we do those in unison, so that you're not just thinking about mitigation and adaptation separately, you are then looking at the unintended consequences, what might be some of the implications from mitigation onto adaptation, and so forth. What we tend to do with this work, looking at climate policy integration, this is a bit of a theoretical slide, but just to give you a sense of what that means in practice, is historically what this has looked at is how we can look at bringing adaptation mitigation more closely together, how to relate them. Because historically when we talk about energy, when we talk about transport, we have been looking at reducing emissions from those sectors. Now, because we're starting to see the impacts of climate change, so you might have transport networks that are affected by flooding. So you might have seen from Storm Kieran a few days ago how the transport and the rail sector were heavily affected by those storms. We're starting to see the impact of heat as well on infrastructure. So now that we're starting to understand and see how those are interlinked, we need to be thinking about how the efforts to drive down emissions and drive up adaptation actions can happen side by side. What we tend to see, though, when it comes to climate action is this is very much a sectoral approach or a policy-focused approach, so driven by individual agendas within, say, government departments. There is more evidence of cross-government departmental working on particular issues, so we are starting to see that integration happen, but we need to be seeing it happening across different sectors, across different stakeholders, particularly when we're talking about risks that the UK is going to become increasingly faced with. Now, just to give you a little bit of context of how we're thinking about the way in which heat in the UK needs to be considered in this space, and I'll give you the example of the 2022 heat waves in a moment. When we tend to think about heat and how we can build our resilience to extreme heat and extreme high temperatures in the UK, the most vulnerable areas really are buildings. So the UK building stock is not adequate enough when it comes to the types of temperatures we're going to experience. And the priorities of policies, quite rightly, have very much been focusing on how can we keep people warm inside those buildings during winter months. That has very much been driving the effort of energy use within buildings and thermal comfort within buildings. What we're now seeing as a result of heat is those homes, those buildings that we've put so much effort and so much energy into keeping warm during the winter can actually become incredibly hot during the summer. So we've been looking at this in one way, in looking at how to keep people less vulnerable, less exposed to cold during the winter. And we haven't been thinking as much about, well, what does that mean if those certain temperature thresholds are exceeded? And one of the reasons we haven't been thinking about that is because we haven't been experiencing significant, consistent, long-term heat waves. Now that's about to change, and it has been changing. So what tends to happen when we're thinking about the solutions to making those buildings cooler during those summer months, during those extreme temperatures, is some people automatically think about, well, how do I keep my home or my building cool? We'll install air conditioning units. Now what happens with air conditioning units, and we see this quite a lot in certain countries like the US and Canada, is a lot of those buildings then do become cool internally, but air conditioning units emit more emissions. So it contributes to the problem that we're trying to solve in the first place. And in addition to that, those air conditioning units produce energy, so they actually have an additional warming effect locally. So you have more and more of those machines operating. It makes the local environment even hotter. So it's a very temporary solution. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to try and encourage particular behavioural responses. So getting people to think differently about the way they can keep cool during summer months, for example. So learning from our Mediterranean neighbours, getting a sense of trying not to expose ourselves to high temperatures during peak times during the day, stay in shaded, cool environments, opening windows early in the morning and late at night to increase ventilation. But those types of behavioural approaches are still something that we need to learn, and we're looking at how we can adopt more of a culture of heat across the UK. So when it comes to this in particular, the question that we tend to think about is, how can we encourage the UK to become more resilient to heat, or how can we adopt a climate resilient net zero? So when it comes to mitigation targets, we tend to aim for a net zero target. So we're looking at climate resilience in terms of climate resilience to extreme heat in line with net zero priorities. And another way of thinking about this is, how can we help keep people and Britain cool during those periods of extreme heat without further increasing our emissions? Now this has come out of a case study approach that we adopted a couple of years ago. So I don't know how many of you were in the country in the summer 2022, but we experienced 5 periods of extreme heat during that summer. We exceeded temperatures of 40 degrees for the first time ever. This has never been recorded in the UK. And the government issued a red alert again for the first time ever. So this is the first of probably what will be many to come. And the fact that we had 5 heat periods over the course of the summer just demonstrates the impact that this could have to the UK. We didn't have any extended periods of heat this past summer, but some of you may remember across Europe and across the world, there were a number of heat waves, a number of wildfires that we experienced. And this really is a preview of what could come to the UK if we don't accelerate our mitigation efforts, but also if we don't increase our resilience to these types of impacts. Now, as a result of those particular heat periods, we saw over 3,000 excess deaths as a direct result of the heat. Now, the problem with heat, in addition to those impacts, is that it's an invisible risk. So people don't necessarily understand how impactful it can be, what their vulnerability might be, compared to other risks such as flooding in the UK. Does anyone know how many deaths were associated with flooding last year? Rough number? So there were about 3 deaths last year. And we had over 3,000 deaths in the UK as a result of heat. Now, the way in which heat-related deaths are measured is a bit trickier than flooding. The heat doesn't kill people instantly, it takes a while, it affects people with different underlying conditions. What we're also seeing, and what we're starting to see from the literature, is it's also affecting people, say, who have mental health problems because they take certain medications, and the impact of heat on those particular medications are only starting to become apparent. So they make people more vulnerable to the heat. So there are a lot of cascading and compounding impacts of the heat that we're starting to understand, and we need to get ahead of ourselves so that we increase our resilience. Now, the research that I undertook been undertaken over the last 18 months has been to look in particular at the 2022 heat waves. And we just really wanted to get a sense of what were the experiences of those people who were working on the ground during those extreme heat events. So what we did is we focused on particular regions in the UK. You can see on the right-hand side, this was actually an Instagram screenshot from the Met Office. So you can see on the right, there's a bit of a U shape, and that's where the dome of heat was experienced during that summer period, and particularly over those 40-degree temperature days. And so we decided to focus on some of the key areas within that area. So we spoke to people in England as a whole, the Yorkshire and Humber region, and cities of London and Manchester. And in terms of people we spoke to, we really wanted to get a sense of the people who were working in the heat and what was it like for them and what were some of the impacts that they were facing and the extent to which they were thinking about resilience to that particular risk, but also minimizing any emissions that they were producing. So we spoke to first responders, the ambulance service, the fire brigade. You may remember there were a number of wildfires that summer as well. We spoke to local authorities and government departments. We spoke to utility providers, the water sector, the transport sector, and we really got a sense of what was happening on the ground. So we conducted a range of interviews about this time last year, and we followed that up with some systems mapping to get a sense of the way in which the impacts were being understood, how people were experiencing the heat, and we ran some focus groups and a policy roundtable. So we spoke to, in terms of the interviews, we spoke to about 40 people, and we reached a saturation point around 30 people, but we wanted to make sure we were getting a good enough sample. So we carried on some of the interviews in each of the locations with each of the different stakeholder groups to really make sure that we were capturing those experiences as thoroughly as possible. And so what we did is we tried to get a sense of what was happening in the case study locations, what were some of the behaviours that were adopted, what were some of the limitations that were felt, what were some of the barriers when it came to strategies. And really we asked quite a bold question in terms of the extent to which the people we were talking to, did they feel England or the UK is prepared for these types of risks going forward? I can tell you in advance that it was pretty much a resounding no, and quite frighteningly. So what I want to go through now is just go back to that question that I posed earlier. So there's a lot of analysis. We've done a lot of analysis on the data itself. A report will be available in a few weeks' time, so you're very welcome to, and I encourage you to have a look at those findings. But what I want to talk about now is just the way in which we can start thinking about this work and our strategies, thinking about, yes, we need to increase the resilience of the UK and society and different stakeholders to heat, but how can we do that in a way that it doesn't make things worse, that it doesn't increase our emissions? And what we've been doing from the data is we've been trying to extract a little bit of a framework. So I'll go through this framework very quickly with you because I'm conscious of time, but I also want to give you a few examples of what came out from the interviews, because from my perspective, those were some of the narratives that really captured what was going on the ground and really highlighted the reality not only of the risk and the impacts, but how difficult it can be to try and keep people cool without increasing emissions. Now, ultimately, when we asked people within the interviews and the focus groups how realistic it was to try and think about keeping Britain cool without increasing emissions, how possible this was, there was a resounding agreement that this was absolutely necessary. But the most common theme that came out from those interviews is that it was going to be a big challenge to do this. And the reason it was we tend to see, when it comes to climate change, efforts are really focused on mitigation. The energy is very much around driving down emissions that lead to climate change in the first place. And this tends to materialise in the form of local or national plans for climate action that are focused on mitigation. As I mentioned earlier, adaptation is starting to take a more prominent role at the table. We're seeing more adaptation plans, and we are seeing more efforts when these plans are being produced of discussions between mitigation, people who are dealing with mitigation, and people who are dealing with adaptation. So we are starting to see that integration already. When it comes to this particular risk also, because it is more seasonal, because historically we don't have that experience and culturally we don't have that experience, it still isn't really a priority for the UK. That is starting to shift because of the work that we've done. We've been talking directly to policymakers. We are trying to get this higher up on their agenda. But what we're also seeing is we're seeing evidence of a need to address an evidence gap. So the Environmental Audit Committee put out a consultation. London had a London Climate Resilience Review. All of those are coming to fruition and will be published, I believe, in the next few weeks or early next year. So there are pockets of work that are happening that are trying to overcome some of those core challenges. Almost as significantly as a challenge was actually there are quite a lot of enabling factors that can allow us to think about how we can keep Britain cool, keep people cool without increasing emissions. And one of the ways of doing this is communication. What we have been seeing when it comes to increasing or trying to increase resilience to extreme heat is historically there's been quite a few disjointed messages when it comes to the heat. It has improved significantly when it comes to media portrayals, but up until a few years ago, media did play a part in almost framing this as a positive. You know, the heat has come out, summer's here, everyone flocked to the beaches. I've seen headlines that say finally a heat wave, when the health implications of that are really quite staggering. So communication is really key around the severity of the risk, around how a particular heat wave is starting to evolve, is going to affect local environments. The Met Office and government do work very closely together to issue certain warnings, and the science is getting better at predicting with quite a significant degree of accuracy the extent to which a heat wave will occur and the duration it will take. We also need to see more policies and top-down influences. A lot of what tends to happen when it comes to heat is very, very localized. It's very much linked to, say, efforts to reduce the impacts on vulnerable groups. We spoke to local authorities who have teams whose primary role is to work with rust sleepers and people who are homeless. And what we've been seeing is they've actually been integrating their approaches for resilience to heat when they go out and speak to homeless people. So they would usually have an offer when they go and talk to it. They usually know who's homeless in their local borough. They would usually go out there and regularly and go talk to them and have an offer for accommodation. When it comes to heat, they will go to them and give them sun cream and give them water and combine that with an offer for accommodation or direct them towards cool spaces that they can go and utilize. So we're starting to see those efforts, but they are very much localized, and we need to start seeing more of these top-down approaches to complement that. I won't go through all of these in detail so that I can get through everything. Another way in which this can be achieved is very much through the way in which this is framed. So the way in which even terms like I've been using, adaptation, mitigation, are not understood by everyone, and they shouldn't be, and they don't need to. But getting an understanding of the way in which people are understanding this risk, the impacts it has on them, and the way it's framed. And this very much comes back to the issue of communication and narratives. So for example, in the research, we were using the term climate resilient net zero. And I admit this is very much an academic term that we've been using to publish this in academic outputs. But when it comes to more of the policy outputs and the non-academic outputs, we're absolutely not going to be using this term because it doesn't really resonate with anyone. Now, just a particular point around the framing of this, I wanted to give you a bit of an anecdotal story, particularly from the first responders we spoke to, because in my view, they really gave the impression and their experiences which resonated quite strongly with how challenging it is to adopt a resilient net zero thinking around this. Now, when we spoke to both the fire brigade and the ambulance service, now the fire brigade were deployed, so they said this was the 19th of July, which is when we saw the 40-degree heat, was the busiest year they'd ever experienced since World War II. That's how busy it was for them. And a lot of them are incredibly skilled, incredibly experienced in dealing with these types of situations. However, the London Fire Brigade, for example, is not necessarily equipped and experienced to deal with rural fires. And what we saw during those heat waves is we did see a number of wildfires across London. And so you had the fire brigade being deployed to one fire, having to make calls of whether or not they needed to deploy to another fire, how many fire tanks to send out. And what they saw with the fire brigade was they saw their equipment, the front of the cabs where the driver sits is air conditioned, but the back isn't. So what they tended to see on some very minor occasions, thankfully, some of the firemen who were heavily exposed to the heat, and they characterized it as, it's as if going into a fire, into hot temperatures with a duvet on, because of all of their equipment, because of all of their uniform. So sadly, some of the firemen actually suffered from heat stroke and heat exhaustion as a direct exposure to the fire and having to go from fire to fire within a short space of time. So that was the fire brigade. Luckily, there weren't any mortalities associated directly with the wildfires. There were destructions of home, I think there was a destruction of a nursery, and there were mental health implications as a result of some of people's pets sadly died within fires. So there's a severe number of repercussions that come out of these types of impacts. And then finally, just in terms of the ambulance service, they were deployed also to go and help people who were suffering from heat stroke. But sometimes they had to make a call as to whether or not they were going to go and pick up someone, an elderly person who was suffering from heat stroke, to put them in the back of the ambulance which had no air conditioning. Some of those heat waves also coincided with a peak in COVID cases. So there was a case, one of the most extreme that I went back into the transcripts last night, one of the most extreme cases was they had someone in the back of the cab who then waited outside a hospital for 25 hours. in the back of an ambulance because there was a COVID spike and there were no beds. And as a result of that, throughout the whole of that summer, there was actually one death because of a situation like that. So they're having to make these decisions about, is it worth actually leaving someone within their home and trying to get them to adopt certain behaviours, or do we need to get them in the back of an ambulance cab, which may or not be air conditioned, to then go into a hospital, which may then be facing a queue when it comes to bringing patients in. So there are a lot of compounding factors which actually make our resilience to heat incredibly difficult. So very quickly, just to finish off, this is very much work in progress, and we're trying to adopt a co-production approach where we're talking to all of the people that we're hoping this will inform so that they can help inform the design of the research. And so whilst climate policy integration is really key to, in my view, to adopting an approach where the UK and people can become more resilient to heat, it's still very much at preliminary stages. We are really trying to figure out what are the barriers, what are the challenges, what are the enablers, and how can we already integrate these approaches in existing policies and strategies. We don't want to have an add-on that local authorities or civil society groups need to consider. We really want to consider how this can be integrated in existing processes. And when it comes to these approaches going forward, there is this huge appetite, but as I'm sure you're all aware, everyone is incredibly stretched. Their priorities are the jobs that they need to deliver. So if we then add on to them, can you try and increase the air conditioning within your ambulance, or can you update your entire fleet in order to ensure that it's more adapted? Can you think about these things? They have different priorities that they need to be considering. So we're considering and we're thinking about this work within the context of all of those complexities. It's a very complex system, but hopefully we can try and make a difference. So I hope that was clear enough. Thank you very much.